because it doesn't always meet the floor evenly, I have to be on it and operating it so that I can say, watch your step.
Okay.
Although at the moment it's meeting the floor evenly, so I don't have to say, watch your step. But that's a code requirement.
Yeah.
Would you mind giving that a little push? There we go.
There we go.
Would you like to hear the alarm?
That reminds me of the old black and white movies, you know? That alarm there.
Yes.
That was
I'm sorry,
it.
is this Mildred Pierce? No.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
It has a recessed door now. Watch your step, please. It didn't meet the floor evenly.
There's a
It obligingly met the floor unevenly, so I could do my watch your step.
Ah,
So why don't we head over here? It's a movie. It's a movie. Yeah. All right.
So this
This
is
is
the
the
Gray
archive.
Barker collection. These are the file cabinets, all the personal correspondence, letters, documents, drawings, cases. That's in here. This is the book collection here.
All this is him.
Yep, this
All
is
cabinets?
this is
and
the
all-
periodical collection here.
Wow.
So I'm thinking what we should do is have you guys like starting here,
Yep.
look for any drawings, illustrations, and text that goes with the case. That's
Okay.
what we're looking for.
All right.
And then when you get through with that, we'll switch over, and then maybe you guys can start on that, and we'll just converge, and we'll cover it all.
Okay, we find a drawing, we call you and say,
Well,
hey, is this worth copying or what?
Whatever, yeah.
Oh, look at this.
We're looking, yeah, I know, it's a good one.
Wow, look at this.
Yep.
Look, did you know Gray Barker? Hey, speaking of which, guys, there's the Mothman. Where's Point Pleasant, West Virginia compared to here?
Well, it's about 70-some miles west and then another maybe 50 south.
So really close to Kentucky, basically.
But not too far.
I knew it
That
wasn't
was
that
one of
far.
our, Spacecraft News, that was one of Barker's publications.
Oh, really? What's interesting about it is when you have the Mothman right on there, a lot of people said the Mothman was an owl, some of the debunkers and stuff like that. I tend to disagree.
I was on that Travel Channel documentary last year.
Oh, really? I love the Travel Channel.
It was fun.
Did they talk to you about this, or did they talk to you about Gray Barker?
No, we talked actually, there was what they were doing was a sidebar on the Flatwoods Monster.
Oh,
And
yes.
so I was there, and Barker cut his teeth on the,
Yeah.
so to speak, on the Flatwoods Monster. That was his original involvement.
What's your belief on the Flatwoods Monster?
I have no idea what to make of it.
It's one of the mysteries, right?
It might be a mystery. A friend of mine, who's been a friend of mine for 20 years, told me last week, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago when I could have used the information, told me last week, he says, oh, I was brought up in Braxton County. I said, yeah, did I mention Colonel Levitt, the fellow who brought the National Guard in to look at the site? Oh, I live next door to Colonel Levitt. I went to school with his kids.
Wow.
You know, and he knew Freddie May and so
Yeah.
forth. So, if Jeff had opened his damn mouth 20 years ago, I could have said, come on, Jeff, let's go down to Flatwoods and talk to your acquaintances. But wouldn't that have been so nice?
Wow, they're not around anymore.
No, they're not really. The closest I got to interviewing any of them was I used to know Raleigh Neal, who was a brother to one of the really young witnesses.
Okay.
And
Okay.
he was there. He didn't go up on the hilltop because he was talking to a girl.
Oh.
Oh, man.
So there are things of different importance. So,
Right.
Let me ask you this, as far as Gray Barker goes, in this town, I mean, is he well known, or guys like you that are historians and stuff like that obviously know about him, but
people knew of him as that
pretty eccentric guy.
as that flying saucer sort of guy. And he was fat. He I think the way that he presented it was he wasn't divulging his own beliefs, and he tailored his presentation to his audience.
Mhm.
So people who wanted to think that it was all nonsense would say, yeah, Gray's he's funny, he's intelligent, he's this, that, and the other. He doesn't really believe that stuff. And if you're talking about an audience that was saucer believers, they would say, oh yes, Gray was involved in serious research. And say, well, what about all the documentation of all the hoaxes and frauds and various foolery? He says, oh, that's just disinformation or something. So, and of course, all of his adult life, Gray was as gay as they make them, although he was 6'4", which is not stereotypically how you picture gay men, and he was a pedophile. So, 14-year-olds were not particularly safe.
Wow.
And he was in trouble with the law for that.
It's a
And
huge
spent
guy.
most of the 60s on probation, actually.
Wow.
So his business obliged him to travel, and so his probation did not limit him to staying in the county.
Let
So I
me
don't-
ask you, what was his business? Like, what did he
Well,
do
he was in-
besides the books and stuff?
Well, when he was young, he was one of the only 2 members of his family down there in the country to finish high school, and he was the only one to go on to college. He graduated from Glenville State College and became an English teacher, and he was hired in a high school in Ellicott City, Maryland. And he taught for a year perhaps, or a semester, I'm not sure which, and he never taught again. So was there an incident? There might have been an incident. Maybe people felt there would inevitably be an incident at some point, who knows? But he never taught again. He went back to working as a projectionist in the theater, which is how he paid his way through college. And he was plucked out of that obscurity by members of the Lovett family who had drive-in theater and similar businesses, film presentation businesses in West Virginia. And he, in those days, the drive-ins were popping up everywhere that you could find the money to build one. And there were no booking agencies to put films in, and so he created a booking agency. And for a few years, he was on the road continually, with his clients, driving all around West Virginia and delivering and picking up films and taking orders and so forth. And of course, picking up teenagers, because who wouldn't do that? And so that was part of it. And then, the Flatwoods incident came along, and he found whoever was employing him at the time gave him enough time off that after a week or so he could go down to Flatwoods and interview people. By the time he got down, maybe it was not even a week, by the time he got down there, the principal witnesses, and I know this is not directly an answer to your question, but I can rattle this off mindlessly. By the time he got down there to interview people, the principal witnesses had gone to New York City to be on a talk show called Read the People, which would divide its time between celebrity guest, ordinary Joe guest. They were the ordinary Joes. Miss May and Gene Lemon, who was 17 and a National Guardsman, the oldest of the witnesses who were there from the beginning. And Miss May and the children were following along behind. So I would say that Gene Lemon would have been the fellow to interview, but did anybody ever seriously talk? I don't know.
Wow.
It seems coincidental that the National Guard was looking for a small plane that had supposedly gone down in the area, was notified, and came then and looked over the hilltop here, and were instructed to take a soil sample. And yet one of the actual witnesses was himself a guardsman. That seems awfully coincidental. So I don't know.
A soil sample for a plane crash because they knew it was something else.
Something.
That's weird.
Who knows what?
Or
it
maybe
was.
they knew what it was.
Yeah, I don't. I lean toward the experimental craft
Well, sure.
explanation.
A lot of this stuff that I believe in is the reason why it's covered up is I think they were using nuclear power back then on stuff. And there was a treaty made where they were not allowed to use nuclear power through the UN and so forth. No more nuclear powered craft, and then you never heard about a nuclear powered craft ever again, but you hear about all these weird sightings. I'm gonna grab one of these things here.
This is cool. Let's get to work, man.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
I'm gonna find, I'll grab this one here. Which side are you gonna start?
You find anything good, Michael?
Yep. That's good stuff.
Definitely.
We're still looking through boxes. I found a bunch of cool stuff. Some old stuff from old magazines. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I'll give them to you.
Image of her mother, for real, out of focus image of her mother with a bad 1960s camera. And it was proven beyond any doubt, and some people thought it was a bird. No, it's her in a dress, and it's her back and her elbows right here. And she was like stretching. That's the truth about that.
Well, we got some cool
And
cases
when you
and
tell people and show people that, and they have pictures of her mother from that day, and you can see it's the same outfit. In his brain, he actually believes this to be true. The guy's 60 years old, I guess. Phil name Phil's like, who is this child? Guy named Phil Koseski. His real name's Gozuski.
Okay.
He goes by a fake last name, so that right there kind of tells you something's up.
Once upon a time, there was a fellow named George Tyler, and in the last year or so of his life, he was traveling around Los Angeles, going to whatever little meetings that involved saucers and that sort of thing, and telling the story that an expatriate now living in Hollywood named Nicholas von Poppen, the Baron Nicholas von Poppen, had been called in by the Air Force to take photographs of a crashed saucer. Might have been the Aztec crash. Something contemporary with all of that. The people who were hearing Tyler didn't so much believe Tyler because his demeanor kind of suggested that he was not to be believed. But a friend of Tyler's wrote out Tyler's narrative about von Poppen and so forth and prepared to send it to Desmond Leslie, and then changed his mind and sent it to Gray Barker instead. And it still begins, "Dear friend Leslie," but Desmond Leslie didn't get it, Gray Barker did. And it was an interesting piece. And Barker then communicated his interest to his anonymous West Coast associate, who was actually a woman named Jackie Sanders. They were, I don't know if they ever met, but they wrote each other all the time. They wrote so much that there's a file for their correspondence for each year. So, you know, to get to that point, you're at the top of Barker's list. Well, anyway, so she looked up the Baron von Poppen and went to his little bungalow in the Hollywood Hills and rang the doorbell. You know, and he came to the door and whatnot, and she wanted to know what he thought about these things that George Tyler had been saying. And he said that, you know, the poor Tyler had lost his mind. And she couldn't really get anything more supportive of the story and whatnot. And whether he directly denied having photographed a crashed saucer or anything, you know, it was just, he knew Tyler when Tyler was sane, and this was not the sane Tyler. And Tyler had since gone into the hospital and died. You can put a conspiratorial shadow over that if you like. And so Jackie went and got this story, and she communicated it to Gray. We have the letter. And she said, now, she gave Gray a warning. She says, this is not the sort of man that you can tell stories about in the press and not expect to hear from attorneys. And so Barker thought, oh, I would love to use that story, but he was a little bit afraid, you know. So he basically sat on it for decades and waited until von Poppen was safely dead. And yesterday, Michael was copying the William Steinman correspondence from like 82, 83.
Yep.
That's very, I mean, Barker only survived until the middle of 84. And so this was right at the end of his life. Finally, von Poppen had predeceased him. And he could pick up the von Poppen story and start publishing it in Gray Barker's newsletter, the publication he had in the early 80s.
Okay.
Which is a little, it's kind of rare today. He was also writing, in those days he was also writing, he had revived his Chasing the Flying Saucers.
I was just
series
reading
stuff.
about Chasing the Flying Saucers.
Yeah,
It was
in the
one of
early
things
80s he
like that.
revived that, and he published additional
popular.
Chasing the Flying Saucers columns in what was then Tim Beckley's
And
current
Kenneth Arnold
publication.
was writing in there as well.
Pardon?
Kenneth Arnold was writing in there as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
Yeah.
The usual suspects.
The guy
Yeah.
who developed the term UFO flying saucer, they were actually boomerang craft that were skipping across the sky. He said, like a saucer would have crossed water. They weren't shaped like a saucer, but because he said that, the term flying saucer comes in, then they turn into saucers. It's really weird how the progression took place
Well,
of UFOs, you know. But go ahead, I'm sorry. to
But
interrupt.
when Barker finally started to tell the story, he thought, well, he decided that he would be the one who went to von Poppen in the Hollywood Hills, went to the little bungalow and pressed the doorbell and so forth. And it had been Jackie Sanders, and it was decades earlier. But, you know, Barker at that point had never been west of Ohio. We have a letter of his where he points out that he's not been west of Ohio. This was before the days of Giant Rock and Barker going out there to George Van Tassel's events and so forth. And so Barker has himself going to von Poppen's store, and he questions von Poppen about this, and von Poppen says, Tyler told all in death, for all the world, like Bela Lugosi. But, you know, it was okay. Von Poppen was dead now, and Barker could cheerfully fictionalize him a little further.
Interesting.
But we have those things. You know, we have the George Tyler letter that was sent to Gray Barker after someone had decided perhaps it did not need to go to Desmond Leslie. And well, a fair amount. You know, we have a von Poppen file.
So this guy, he was born in when was he born and when did he die? Kind of like
Whom?
Gray Barker. I want to know like his health.
Barker
Like
was born in the 20s and died in the 80s. He didn't live to be quite 60.
All
I
right.
think probably 1925 to 1984. He drank too much. No, he was gay, and some of his friends and some observers think that he may have contracted the dread, HIV and AIDS, and may have died of that. When David Houghton, who has that Confessions of a UFO Investigator blog, he was here for about a week a few years ago, working on Barker and the notorious Carl Allen / Carlos Allende, you know, and Halperin produced a letter in which Barker was explaining that he hadn't answered the letters because he had a bout with pneumonia, and it was not the cold and flu season particularly, and that makes a person wonder if perhaps he had AIDS in fact and he had a bout with pneumocystis pneumonia. We don't know, but the thing that immediately killed him was kidney failure.
I was going to say, if he drank a lot, and
He
he was in
drank.
his late 50s, that's about all the longer people that drink a lot last.
Yeah,
Especially if you drink whiskey.
yeah.
It'll take your...
And I don't know
Yeah,
what his
renal failure, your liver goes, and then your kidneys fail.
I know that he drank gin
simultaneously.
because of the notorious 2 gin bottles.
He drank too
Well,
much.
no, I mean he was a seducer. So if you were a young man in a leather jacket who came by the house,
Oh, goodness.
then as a guest, your glass would come from the gin bottle that actually had gin in it, whereas the host would pour his glass out of the gin bottle that had water in it,
Wow.
so as to retain his capacity to take advantage of his guests.
So basically,
It's a
that
little
was his
bit
way of
creepy.
roofing somebody back in the day.
In the day, yes.
You didn't know that
He
he ever.
cheerfully describes this stratagem in his Mulberry Place letters.
Huh.
Well,
He was really very funny
to
about
each
it.
his own.
He referred to
Weird.
someone who was attractive was interesting from the standpoint of UFO research. That's how he would describe it.
Oh, we have to run out of here then if big 6'5" Gray Barker was in here.
No, he was only 6'4".
Well, then he's
And,
not much
and like a lot of
he's
tall
not any
people,
taller-
he stooped a little because he was taller than
Well,
most
he
of the
was
people he
probably
talked
about
to.
like that then.
Yeah.
I'm 6'3", so.
See, there you go.
Well,
So.
he's like 6'2", I think. Right, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm like
Like an inch
6'1".
taller.
I'm like 6'1".
Yeah, you're
But
smaller
Gray
than
had that
6'2".
one success, when he got one book published by a publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, he became a publisher. He published his own material and other
Yeah.
people's material. He was Howard Menger's publisher. among
Yeah, I
others.
found that fascinating. There was a lot of stuff about Menger. He was writing and stuff like that. I was reading
Well,
about.
Barker was corresponding with Morris Jessup when Barker was working on They Knew Too Much and Morris Jessup was working on the case for the UFO. And each of them preparing this book and trying to get it published and dealing with, the complications of being an author and dealing with a publisher and so forth.
Well, it sounds
And,
to me like his claim to fame was he's the first guy we know that seems to have talked about the Men in Black.
Yeah, so that was in his book.
Movies made about the Men in Black, obviously. But as you described earlier, I mean, that seems to be to me his biggest thing,
Oh, yeah.
Men in Black. And that's
He managed to get a
huge.
book published in 1956, and there's a lot of different material in it.
Mhm.
Some of it is pretty comic indeed,
Mhm.
and in the middle of it is the story of Alvender and the mysterious visit and so forth.
Would you classify him as brilliant, or how would you classify him
He was,
intelligence-wise?
he was a fish out of water.
But he obviously...
He was a bright guy who could have done things in the larger world,
Right.
but he was one of those, well, the stereotype is that bright people in places like West Virginia stay right here in the comfort of the hills and do not go out and test the waters in the larger world.
Right.
And Barker was like that. He would go to New Jersey and to New York City and appear on the what was the name of that guy whose talk show Barker was on in those days? Long John Neville. And he would do those kinds of things, but it was just a visit.
Yeah.
He never uprooted himself and tried to, live in the modern world. And,
So he
West
was
Virginia in the
a,
1950s was like, it was primitive in a lot of ways. I mean, I was a kid then, and so I have sort of kid memories of it. But
so he's like reclusive, if you would say.
well, he had a secret that he didn't want to share.
Yeah. Right. Well, back then, if you were gay,
He was
or
a frustrated
something,
writer.
Yeah.
You know, and so the UFO gave him an opportunity to write.
Right.
And he was not a dedicated rewriter. A lot of his stuff seems to be first draft and a few corrections in the margin. But he was a better writer than most of the people who were putting out UFO books, and the ability to write, you know, if it's just like pulling teeth to get through a second chapter, then your UFO book is not going to be very successful.
Right.
And Barker could carry you right along.
Well, you guys have an awesome UFO collection back here too, book-wise.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, Jeremy, did you see all the
For the
books they
most
have?
part, those are
I think that's-
Barker's own copies.
Yeah, why
Right.
don't we go back
The
there?
first generation of them. Let's go back and
Let's
take
go
a look.
back there and take a look.
All
He
kinds
probably-
of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's the books back here. You can't find these anymore. Again, they're first generation. They want big bucks for these things.
Yeah, and you know, some of the things we don't have, like, you know, we don't have his original edition of Menger's book. We have translations of it because, you know, he arranged for translations into French. Oh, the French language critical edition of They Knew Too Much.
Yes, there it is. There's his Men in Black book written in French.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I
mean,
contributed
there it
a
is,
little bit of
first generation.
information.
Oh, yeah?
The editor thanks me in French in a
Interesting.
footnote. And I think being thanked in French in a footnote is about as good as it gets.
Well, some of those magazines
As a librarian,
out there are
yeah,
French,
definitely.
you know, that I was going through, and I was like, wow.
That press in Paris has a series of UFO classics, and this was the second volume that they published in that enterprise.
Interesting.
These are the Andy, a lot of these are the Andy Colvin, as we call them, pirate editions.
Okay. Above Top Secret, Timothy Good. This is an excellent book.
This is Barker's. This is the original.
Uh-huh.
They knew too much about flying saucers, and it
Yes.
probably.
Look at
well,
that.
There's Barker's.
Oh, wow.
Perfectly legible. The library was having one of its annual celebrations of its own existence.
Uh-huh.
And they invited Mr. Barker to come and speak, and he donated a copy of his book and autographed it for
Wow.
them. And that was in this building in 1957, I
And that's a
think.
first edition, obviously.
There was no second, but
Yeah.
there was no second in that format. There's a paperback edition I call the Summer of Love edition in 1967. Then there's the Illuminate Press Conspiracy Theory edition of 1991 or 92. I think it's 92. You know, that's funny. I don't see the Summer of Love edition on the shelf.
Michael may have it out there.
Possibly.
He was going through every book here.
And you know,
Probably has it.
the Bender book that he published in the late 60s, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, I've never seen the hardbound edition. We only have the authorized paperback reprint.
And
Bender.
why don't you talk about on this wall and show them the personal correspondences? and
Oh
stuff,
gosh,
too.
there's a world of things in here. Who knows what we'll find?
And that's what Michael's been really
Sure.
digging into.
Yeah, this is like the most dense collection of just real hard data.
Yeah, this is a lot.
Yeah, there we go.
No, he's got stuff about Bigfoot.
Yeah, this has, you know,
The case for Bigfoot. And
You know, back in 1957,
Do you know where I can find more Townsend Brown stuff, or more stuff about like this, anything related to science or technology or?
yeah, no doubt, but not that I can pull off the top of my head. You know, most of the
Yeah.
stuff that I'm familiar with enough to talk about it without doing my homework first is involved with the personalities. These are the Jessup files. You know,
okay.
you know.
What do we have there?
Barker and Jessup were friends. Jessup sometimes came to Clarksburg and visited with Barker, and sometimes Barker visited Jessup. And as I said, they were both working on their books together. After the books were out, Barker eventually began to step back from the correspondence, and Jessup's last few letters to Barker go unanswered. And then he dies, of course. He gassed himself in Florida,
Wow.
the author of The Case for the UFO. And
That's weird.
yes,
You say gassed himself.
in his car.
Outside,
Yeah, and we have a copy of the report from the coroner. You know, Barker set off for this stuff. I think he wanted to encourage the idea that Jessup had been silenced because he knew too much about flying saucers.
That is interesting.
And I don't imagine that Mr. Jessup was silenced because he knew too much, but there's so many bits and pieces. You know, Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, was published in hardback and a paperback reprint shortly after, and a copy was picked up by Carl Allen, the notorious Pennsylvanian who normally called himself Carlos Allende, but sometimes he Germanized himself to Karl Meredith von Allenschmidt.
Wow.
And he may have had other ethnic aliases that he
Wow.
liked to use. And he seems to have been powerfully delusional.
Do you know what part of Pennsylvania he's from? That's where I'm from.
You know, I used to know.
We can look it
But
up.
I don't know. I'm getting older, you know, the nouns are dropping away. There's
Carlos
so many of them.
Allende.
I know, I'm 47 now.
Carl Allen.
Where are the nouns going?
Was, yeah.
Well,
Nouns are- yes, exactly.
Carl at some point procured a copy of this book and began putting notes in the margin. And the notes were identified as Mr. A, Mr. B, and someone called Jemmy, J-E-M-I. And it's like they're sort of talking back and forth in the annotations. And once, Allen did not immediately admit to having created all the annotations, but he eventually did. And at some point then he picked up the book and put it in a mailer and sent it off to the Office of Naval Research. And people at the Office of Naval Research, I think, thought that it was, you don't usually get this purely delusional material in this quantity, you know. And so they decided that they would have a reprint of the book made with, you know, with the notes in the margins and so forth. And the person who did this was Austin Stanton, the head of Vero Manufacturing, a defense contractor in Texas, which was very forward-thinking in electronics and so forth.
Right.
And so Stanton's own secretary, a young woman whose first name was Michael, helpfully, wrote, you know, she sat at the typewriter and whatnot and created the stencil from which the Vero edition of the Case for the UFO was published. And so the folks at Vero wanted to do everything by the book. You know, they dealt with the publisher for the rights to do a limited reprint. There were only like 25 copies of it run on the mimeograph machine or whatever. And they also got in touch with Mr. Jessup and went to see him. And Jessup said, and Jessup had never seen the annotated edition of his book with these strange comments in the margins, and he recognized them, and he said, I received postcards from someone who must be the same person because it's exactly the same sort of thing. So he produced the postcards, and there was postcard 1, Jessup's response, and postcard 2. John Keel ended up in possession of those, I think, and we have copies of them courtesy of John Keel here in the file. And by God, those 2 postcards sent to Morris Jessup by Carl Allen are the genesis of the Philadelphia experiment.
Are you serious?
Allen was the guy who initially imagined or conceived the story of the disappearing ship.
Wow.
And the place that it existed, as far as I can tell, only in those postcards to Morris Jessup.
Do you have the documentation for that?
Sure. And then, so
How
the folks
huge that is?
from
Yeah.
Vero, who were reprinting Carl Allen's wonderful annotations, Jessup said, well, yes, you can also have copies of the postcards. So they published that material in an appendix to Jessup's text in the Vero edition, and that's when the Philadelphia experiment first starts to leak out into the world, and they're supposed to be rumored a little bit for people who have seen the only 25 copies Vero edition. And eventually Riley Crabb, Meade Lane's successor at BSRA, begins corresponding with a woman in Texas, no, in Arizona, I forget. But anyway, a woman in the Southwest who has access to that, the young secretary who created the stencil, they let her have a copy as well. So one of the 25 copies was hers, and after she married, she left it at home with her parents. And her mother was willing to loan it to a woman called Rose. And it was Rose who allowed Riley Crabb to have the loan of it. And at some point, I think Riley Crabb decided that it might be nice to have the actual annotated volume. So they bought a copy, Riley and his wife, of the Case for the UFO, the original, and began writing in the margins the annotations that were described in the Vero edition, I think perhaps in hopes of saying, this is the real one, see the annotations in the margin. Maybe that's what they were trying to do.
Interesting.
And Riley borrowed it on 2 occasions, and he printed some of the material to do with, because nobody was really interested in what Alan had to say in the annotations to the book. They were interested in the disappearing ship.
Yes.
And so Crabb starts writing a little bit about that. And there's some negotiation at one point whether maybe Riley Crabb and Gray Barker could jointly republish the thing, although most of the interest is really in this little appendix and so forth. And Barker didn't want to share the glory. Barker was acquainted with this mysterious woman, Rose, and it was like 1972. She had been involved in UFO for 20 years. She was about done with it, so she boxed up all of her UFO materials and sent them to Gray Barker here in West Virginia, including what she had now been given after having been loaned it, the young secretary's text of the Vero edition, and that's how Barker was able to publish the Vero edition. And so it was because that was the first wide distribution of the material about the disappearing ship. And so Barker always said, if you want to know who created, who's responsible for the Philadelphia experiment, it's me.
The Philadelphia experiment is
Yeah,
just...
Did you hear that, guys? Did you just hear
Continued
that?
to annotate. After Barker was involved in this and was going to publish the Vero, then out of the woodwork comes Carl Allen a decade and a half later, after his having originally annotated the book, and he shows up eventually on Barker's doorstep and starts annotating further in Barker's published version of the annotated book. So then there's like a couple generations of additional annotations. And we have a copy of the Barker reprint of the Vero edition, The Case for the UFO by Morris Jessup, with actual red and black ball pen annotations by Carl Allen himself.
So there was never any such experiment above the USS Eldridge.
So as I've heard other people say that it really happened, but what seems to have happened is that Carl Allen imagined that it happened and wanted to talk to Morris Jessup about it. And as I say, it found its way out by way of the Vero edition, and then Riley Crabb, and then finally Gray Barker. And see, one of the things that Rose did when she boxed up all of her UFO stuff and sent it to Gray, she included all of her correspondence with Riley Crabb. So we know about Riley Crabb's borrowing of the volume and his reprinting of part of it in one of his publications and his creating a sort of facsimile of the original annotated book. It's all in the correspondence. And who was Rose?
Rose was a secretary.
Rose was the office manager at NICAP in the days of Townsend Brown.
Yeah, Townsend Brown. Remember
Yeah, it's the same woman.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I didn't mean to bring her into the story, but I like the way that people. There's a
interesting how
limited
all-
number of people involved here.
Yeah,
It's very
interesting how it
circular.
ties together. Did you ever hear anything about Al Bielek? He used to say he was involved in the Philadelphia experiment.
No.
He was the time traveler guy. He died back in the 90s.
Well, that's a shame. for
You
a
have
time traveler.
you have Phil Schneider, who claims his father, who was in the Navy, he was involved in the Philadelphia experiment. But there's a commonality among
There's a
all
guy,
these
I know
people.
a
They
fellow
all
named
talk.
Don Rose who claims that when he was a boy, he knew a man who had witnessed the disappearance
Yes.
of the ship and so forth. But I think once the story gets told, people come out and say, "Well, I saw it. Of course it happened. I saw it." First-person testimony is what's wanted, and human beings being what they are, first-person testimony appears.
When the ship rematerialized, excuse me, when the ship rematerialized, there were people that were half fused into the deck of the USS Eldridge, and the stories are crazy. Michael, did you ever hear the story he has just told about how the Philadelphia experiment actually, what really happened, how the legend began? This is unbelievable.
It's
Look,
historic.
yeah, he just sat here and told us that. I was not expecting that, because that's something I've looked into over and over, because it's one of the mysteries where you want to know. Wow. I mean, that was interesting.
Yeah, we have photocopies of Alan's postcards to Morris Jessup, and we have a copy of Jessup's response to the first of the postcards. He doesn't seem to have responded to the second.
I mean, that's
He was quite encouraging. It was he was sort of like Barker. Jessup was sort of like Barker. He says, "Oh, this is fascinating. Tell me more." And we don't think that Jessup was sharing this story with others. I think he was hoping that, see, the same Rose that we're talking about, Jessup knew her pretty well because he lived in Washington, D.C. at the same time that she was involved there at NICAP and so forth. And I think she carried over into Kehoe's time there, but I'm not sure of that. And I don't want to say it in front of people who would question it because I may be wrong about that. But Rose was writing a book about, so help me, UFOs and the Bible. And she met Morris Jessup, and in one of his letters to Gray Barker, he mentions that she's working on this project. And then, within a year, out comes Morris Jessup's book, UFO and the Bible. And I think that he took the project over from her with her consent, because she never published above the level of articles in the periodical. Yeah, I know, it's wonderful the way that it all, a lot of it fits together.
Yeah.
And what we would like to do with the Barker correspondence at some point, if I were willing to work on it consistently, is make a master calendar of his activity, especially during his heyday.
Yeah, complete timeline.
1952 or 53 forward, a master calendar of all the correspondence. Who's Gray Barker corresponding with on this day, and what's the tenor of the conversation? Because if Barker's writing back and forth with Dominic Lucchese, who's also part of the International Flying Saucer Bureau and whatnot, they didn't take Bender very seriously, and since he tended to act like he was, the boss and so on and so forth, they called him Daddy disparagingly when they talked about him in the third person.
Interesting.
And Augie Roberts, they felt, had gotten so involved with UFO that he needed more confidence that this material was true, and they were willing basically to hoax it a little just to help Augie along, because Augie was not prepared for, once you've invested in something and you're convinced that it's true, and then the truth of that thing is exploded, then that's damaging to the people who believed in it. And so they were sort of coaxing some of it along for Augie's benefit, according to what I've read in the correspondence.
Yeah. And Barker was good friends with Adamski?
No,
Or Menger?
Menger. And he was Menger's publisher.
Yeah, okay.
And
Howard Menger claims he was on the moon
yeah,
and
sure.
everything else.
Yeah,
Right.
and there's all this stuff. There's that famous photograph of Menger having his little convention out on
Sure,
the
the
lawn,
desert.
and
Right,
there's the
on the
people
lawn.
sitting over here at the table, and one
Yes.
of these guys gets pulled out of it, and people decide that he's a Venusian called Valiant Thor.
Valiant Thor,
Except
yes.
sometimes they pick the wrong guy, because there's
Yes.
two guys and a woman. And
Have you ever seen the guys that solved the whole Valiant Thor mystery?
I don't know.
We had Dr. Frank Strangis. Do you know who
Who was-
Frank Strangis is?
Oh, of course. In fact, we have many, many, many additional copies of My Friend from Beyond Earth. Would you like one?
Yeah.
By Frank Strangis?
Yes.
Well,
I've seen Frank talk already. He's a very interesting guy. You have Frank Strangis, and you have a guy named Jesse Womble. And they claim that sometimes Womble was Valiant Thor, and other times they claim it was Frank Strangis in those pictures.
but Frank doesn't look. Well, I don't know.
Well,
I
it
have pictures
depends,
of
but if you've ever noticed that a lot of the pictures of Valiant Thor are from the side, and they have a very, Strangis before he died, still had a very thick head of hair, and he had this hairline that was kind of identical to some of the Valiant Thor pictures from the
Yeah.
side. They certainly don't look alike from the front, I will agree with you there.
Yeah.
But this Jesse
I'm inclined to
Womble,
think that the people at the little table, and so
Yeah.
forth,
Yes,
one of them
that's
has a
interesting.
newspaper. I suspect they're journalists.
yeah, exactly.
They look like their approach to the topic is different from everyone else's approach.
Yes, this is supposed to be Val Thor here.
Yeah.
Um,
But that's not. And the other fellow in the photos is sometimes also identified that way. And
Right.
He looks more like the other fellow looks more like Frank Strangis, I think.
Right, we'll look at that. Is it in
I
here?
swear. But Strangis was, he made part of his living conning people, and he lured.
Was he
Augie
really a
Roberts in
doctor?
at one point.
Was he really a doctor?
Continue straight for 20 minutes to State Route 234.
This is answering machine. This is going to be hilarious.
Record your message after the tone. Simply hang up when done. Or for delivery options, press the pound sign.
Yes, this is Anonymous, and we've been driving through Pennsylvania, headed back from West Virginia. We're gonna try to cleanse the blood, but before we do that, we're gonna stop off at a couple of places where I know they've got aliens in the ground. I know they've got extraterrestrial vehicles in the ground up here. It's on the right-hand side next to where Phil Schneider lives. And there's also a base. It's not called Dulce, but it's really near it. It's close to it in size and stature. But the reason why I'm calling you is because I wanted to thank you for hanging around me last night and talking to Dr. Dan Burrish with me. Michael, call me sometime. Again, it's anonymous. And I hope you have a safe trip home, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Bye.